So I publish this book and I say, this is, going back to this, this is not a one-off thing. This is a permanent feature, and I argue that, the Western world peaked and it's now entering a long phase of relative decline, not absolute decline, because growth is still continuing. It's just much slower than the developing world, which means that the political balance in the world is going to change because developing countries are going to become increasingly assertive, increasingly powerful, increasingly able to assert themselves. And at this time I'm lecturing at a university in France, and one Easter I'm there, and a friend of mine from my Oxford days, he's an artist and he owns a house in the south of France, and he says, "Look, why don't you come and join us for Easter?" And your old friend Peter Heather was someone, again, I've been friends with in Oxford, but he's a historian and I'm a political economist. We've never actually compared our work, but we end up spending this weekend together over the Easter weekend. And this is about 2004. And basically catching up, and he says, "What have you been writing?" And I said, I told him about my book and about what I found, what's happening in the Western world. And I asked him, "What have you been writing?" And he told me about a book he was just about to publish, which in fact became the bestseller, On the Fall of the Roman Empire. And the thing that struck us both in the course of this weekend is how similar our narratives were of two entirely different phenomena. And we said, it could be there's something that actually runs through the history of empires that leads, the very thing that leads to their ascent ultimately leads to their decline. We start with the simple fact that although every single empire in history claims to be eternal, not one that is. What to choose any empire of your choosing in history and identify its core and then say which of those cores is today still the richest part of what had hitherto been its empire. And not one. And Peter had come up with a thesis in his book called Newton's Third Law of Empires. And Newton's Third Law of Empires says the exercise, in fact, it's in his subsequent book, Empires and Barbarians, which is a sort of sequel to the Fall of the Roman Empire, but he develops the idea. By this point, he's read Emanuel Wallerstein's World Systems Theory, and he's starting to think of core and periphery. He says that the exercise of imperial power generates an opposite and equal reaction among those affected by it, until they so reorganize themselves as to blunt the imperial edge. And essentially what he's saying is that in the case, he's really talking about the barbarian invasions that bring down Rome, but I said, when we started talking about it, I said, Peter, there's something even deeper than that, okay? It's not just that they get tired of the Romans plundering them for slaves and for amber, but they actually have the capacity initially to resist Roman incursions, to negotiate greater deals with the Romans, then ultimately to invade the Romans. That what it is a development of economic capacity that's really fundamentally driving this process, is that the very exploitation that enriches the empire leads to development in the periphery until the periphery is able to sustain and support viable states that can then withstand the imperial state. So that it really creates resource bases necessary for emergent states to build bases. And when we talked this through and we started writing together, and I floated the idea in an article I published in an American journal called Foreign Affairs, an article called The New Middle Ages, and I said, we're heading into a sort of a New Middle Ages, not in the sense that people like Nigel Farage talk about the Dark Ages, because all these foreigners are all these barbarians, because this is of course a trope that is very resonant, particularly in America and the American right, and I was approaching it in an entirely different way, but the idea, and Peter said that that helped him to sort of crystallize some thinking about how these states on the periphery of the Roman Empire, and of course the other thing which happens is states start to within the provinces. That what happens is these proto-states begin launching attacks on the edge of the Roman Empire, that the nobility that runs these sort of frontier zones begin negotiating deals, as it were, with the invading armies. Look, if you let me, I will run this area for you. I will collect taxes. Instead of sending them to the imperial treasury in Rome, I will give them to you. In return, you let me keep my... And that's really how the empire falls. The image of hordes coming and sacking. I mean, the sacking of Rome is almost just... I mean, people sacked Rome periodically because it was sort of what you did, right? You know, sort of, you came home with future kids and you boasted to sack Rome, but so like going to see a Chelsea football match, you know, it's similar kind of motivation, similar kind of people. It's me. Not genteel like my club. That economic convergence occurs as a result of this, and it's affected, and this is using economic terminology, by the mobile factor of production. Okay? And that's the big distinction between the modern period and the ancient period. All the talk about barbarians at the gates you hear among right-wing populists in Europe, the analogy is completely inapt for a number of reasons. You know, the obvious one is that the invasions of Rome were organized by coherent, viable states which are organizing massive movements of population. Okay? The so-called invasions of Western countries are managed by immigration departments in Western countries. I mean, these are completely controlled from the core. And they're importing these workers because they need to import these workers. And in antiquity, capital was not mobile. Capital in the Roman Empire was farmland and aqueducts and roads. And there's no point trying to, you know, cart a farm from Italy to Germany. You can't. So what you do is you move in and you occupy the farm. But of course today, capital is highly mobile. And what has happened is that what's causing this convergence is not, in fact, I mean, there is an element of that. Trump isn't wrong when he says Mexicans are coming and depressing wages. Mexicans are coming and depressing wages because it's the only way that American industry can remain competitive, because their wage rates are too high for them to be able to compete. And so what neoliberalism did is it made it possible for Western firms, instead, you know, the mountain, Muhammad doesn't have to go to the mountain comes to Muhammad. That you can actually, what is happening is the massive migration that has occurred in modern history, and it's the biggest, by far the biggest migration in human history. As a colleague of mine who was, of mine and Peter, who was the Chile Chair of Medieval History in Oxford, said, he said, you know, all this talk about the Volkswanderung that follows the fall of the Roman Empire, this massive movement of peoples, he says it pales in comparison to what is happening just in China alone today. A massive movement of population, not to the core of the empire, but to the coastal zones of the developing world, which create these huge labor reserves, and capital from the developed world is moving and taking advantage of that labor. That's the only thing which has kept Western firms competitive, because the reason industry, there's so much deindustrialization in the United States is because for fundamentally the same task, you're paying 50 times the cost. I mean, it just makes you simply, the economy cannot survive if it's going to try and sustain that kind of imbalance. And so, really, in a sense, you know, we have this section of the book, you know, Attila the banker, you know, the barbarians who are moving money, and we're not using barbarians in a normative sense. It's unfortunate the terms come to be so morally laden. It is simply a reference. The Greeks referred to the people, you know, beyond their borders as barbarians, because they couldn't understand their language. And it said it sounds like barbar, and that's where the term comes from. Of course, Roman historiography always saw the barbarians as inferior people, just as, you know, you just have to read the Confucian classics to see what the Chinese thought of their own barbarians. They thought of course, you know, when Marco Polo came and visited Kublai Khan, you know, Kublai Khan thought of him as just a barbarian, you know, bringing these few trinkets, what he thought was the, you know, the great wealth of the West, and he thought, well, you know, I don't really have any use for this. I mean, so empire is always, in a sense, there's always this narrative of that wonderful book by Jane Coetzee, you know, Waiting for the Barbarians, that always accompanies any empire, is this sort of sense of superiority which justifies the imperial position. So that's our argument in a nutshell, is that, that what we're seeing is not accidental. These trends run through the history of empire, and it's caused by the fact that you get this, in the words of Jeffrey Kay, who wrote a book about Ghana using a Marxist analysis, which was critical of dependency theory, and he made this wonderful statement, which only makes sense if you know Marxist political economy. He says, where countries in the developing world have remained poor, it's not because colonialism exploited them, it's because colonialism underexploited them. Meaning that where you get, the greatest exploitation would have taken place in the settler colonies, that you get the greatest transformation of the economy, that you're, by exploitation in the Marxist sense, that you're exploiting the various, putting to productive use the various resources, which could be labor, which could be land. Again, we've come to invest exploitation now with a normative content, but in Marxist political economy, it has none. It simply is that idea of exploiting in a relationship between classes in which a surplus is appropriated, and that surplus, the greater the surplus appropriation, the more rapid the development. But that this exploitation leads to the, as it did in the colonies, it led to the ability to sustain these independence movements, which very significantly, with almost no exception, this is one of the significant things about the colonial independence movements, are not backward looking, they're forward looking. It's not, we're going to reclaim. You get that, those initial, if you look at the rebellions in the 19th century, and you compare them with the independence movements of the 20th century, the significant difference by and large is that the 19th century ones are driven by pre-colonial elites trying to reclaim their previous position. The independence movements are almost always driven by a new class of typically Western educated, very much in the modern economy, new political elites who are looking to import the model of the modern nation state into their context and use it to develop their economy. And they, by the late colonial period, it is the late colonial period because they had the ability to simply make it impossible for the empires to continue operating under the classical model. But that doesn't, of course, initially end the empire. And this is the thing, one insight of Roman history. How am I doing for time, Vincent? Okay, I'll wrap up this last point. It is good, yes. So, the critique we sometimes get among some of our colleagues who are historians or political scientists in particular, the historians are more receptive to this argument than the political scientists, and the economists simply don't get it. But they will say, the Roman Empire was a unitary empire. You're talking about several European empires. And the United States didn't even have an empire other than a small collection of relatively insignificant colonies and brief periods of occupation in the Philippines. And so it's ludicrous to talk about the Roman Empire and a Western Empire. But so we have a section in the book where my colleague sort of looks at how the Roman Empire was actually run, and the notion of it is it was a unitary empire only in name. It became known among historians as the inside-out empire because it was essentially run from the provinces. It was run from the provinces by local elites who were almost always not Romans, people who come with the legions, but rather people who had actually originated in the provinces and had Romanized, they had acculturated. They'd learned, if you wanted to gain a position in the Roman Empire, you had to learn Latin, you had to learn the classics, you had to wear togas, you had to live in cities. There was this, as he put it, Latin towns and togas. This is what defined the Roman elite. But the actual administration day to day was entirely local. And so to say, the cultural similarities that you get in the modern period, today it would be the same thing in just about any country. It's expected you would have a university education on the Western model. You would be literate in English if you're involved in policy making, because economics, for all intents and purposes, the official language of economics is English. And so you get the same sort of idea that everybody, even in these states which are now independent, would have seen themselves as being westernizers. So the notion that you now get, you can say they're operating, because the principal thing is to understand the empire as a zone of economic accumulation, okay? And that relationship continues, that these are countries which are highly integrated into the core of the Western economy. They do the bulk of their trade with those countries, the direction of flows. Of course, they do all their banking. The global financial system remained, until very recently, dominated by a few capitals, a few financial capitals in the Western world, simply because all governments banked in mainly US dollars. And so they had to keep all their reserves, which meant that there was a massive pool of savings in New York in particular, but also in London, in Frankfurt, in Paris, that was available to governments in those countries. Interestingly, at the Bretton Woods conference, John Maynard Keynes was desperate that Britain should keep its empire explicitly, because he said, then we get to bank the reserves of all these colonies, and we will need that to rebuild Britain. And the Americans, of course, pushed for decolonization because, among other things, they knew that that would enable New York to supplant London as the world's financial center, as it did. And all that money would be banked in New York because they adopted the gold standard, and the US dollar became the currency for trade. And it was so dominant that even the Soviet Union conducted all its foreign trade outside of the Comecon countries. The 11 countries that belonged to CMEA in US dollars. It was an absolutely, and that was the same sort of ubiquity of the money, in the same way that you had Roman coins that were still being found in well beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire, simply because all roads did lead to Rome. It's just the modern period, it's all financial transactions ultimately work their way back to New York. Anyway, I hope that's not too technical for you. I'm trying to sum it up in reasonably accessible prose, but I have no idea. I think there's probably more economic terminology than you're all comfortable with.
Well, I think I would like to hear more about the argument of the book, actually, which I guess is one that you're developing together. Mm-hmm. And this sense that it is the outside that, it sounds in some ways as though you're saying empire colonization builds capacity among the colonized, the oppressed, and eventually they take their built capacity and develop their autonomy at least, and often then move in and take over resources from their previous oppressors. They get better at it.
Right.
Right. And is it the sort of argument that the metropole, that it gets lazy, degenerates, and these hungry people on the margins who are working really hard to make their way up, they eventually walk all over the sort of latter generations? Or is it a more technical economic argument?
The way to think of it, because in virtually all, if you're familiar with this book, the first volume of which was published in 1776 by Edward Gibbon, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This is a book which has cast a very long shadow over the Western imagination. Interestingly, not over Western historiography, because although historians of the Roman Empire will still read it, in no small measure for its prose, because it's a wonderful bit of writing. But it's quite considered quite dated and essentially wrong now. But in virtually all other disciplines, nobody got the memo. Economists, if you're going to write, for example, this book, Why Nations Fail, written by a couple of economists, Ashmole and Robinson, it's a good book, it's a good try. But they, for example, cite Gibbon in defense of their argument. It's a very common thing to do. You cite Gibbon, and the basic narrative of Gibbon is that imperial decline is essentially caused, as you put it, Jody. It's by that, what is essentially moral decay. They lose the will to fight. Neil Ferguson, when the Bataclan bombings occurred in Paris, wrote an article in the Boston Globe, and he said, this is how empires fall. We let the barbarians come. They don't believe in our ways. They want to destroy us. Okay, it's quite explicit. What we argued is, and this is, and interestingly, Neil Ferguson quoted Peter Heather in that article, and Peter was pretty annoyed with him because Peter's making exactly the opposite argument. He's saying it's not what happens in the core of the empire that determines, or it is in the ascendant phase of the empire. Okay, in the ascendant phase of the empire, the core is what determines. Think of it as a pebble dropped in a bucket of water. Initially, and incidentally, migration is an important part of that. In the ascendant phase of an empire, the direction of migration is outward. It's from the core to the periphery, so it is colonization. And then in the phase of the ascendance of the periphery, the movement is going in the opposite direction, although, as I say, the big difference in the modern period is that most of this population movement, the vast majority, is not going into the core, it's going into the periphery, but giving countries and what was the periphery the wherewithal to build their industry. Okay, so that it's not on the battlefield that the West falls. It's in trade negotiations, for example. 1999 Seattle Trade Summit. I see that as a turning point because it's the first time the developing countries get together as a bloc and resist the standard model that's used in trade negotiations, which is a handful of Western countries get together, agree an agreement, then they would present it to the government. Sort of divide and conquer strategy. And Peter's argument was the fall of Rome is driven entirely by what's happening in the periphery of the Roman Empire, just as in the modern period. The fundamental problem is, you could say, it manifests itself as decadence, that people are lazy, and there certainly is an element of that. For example, one of the biggest drivers of capital export, there's all this talk about multinational corporations, but the biggest driver of all is actually pension funds. Because you have pension funds which account for something, by some estimates, and these are mostly pension funds in Western countries, something like 1/5 of total global assets. Okay? And the fundamental problem we have is this. These pension funds were created at a time when people lived 5 or 6 years beyond retirement. They're now living 20. They're not expecting to spread that 5 or 6 years over 20 years. But you have this problem, that the returns on investment in developed countries. Look, since if you had put your money into the stock market in the United States or Britain in 1999, at the top of that bubble, the dot-com bubble, back down the crash, back up the housing boom, crash, back up again. But if you had, that over the last 20 years, the money you put into that stock market, you'd basically be breaking even. You wouldn't have made, you wouldn't have lost. But when you have to pay out to your beneficiaries, the equivalent of 4 and 5% of your pension fund, you have to find a way to augment your returns. So the only thing to do is to invest where the returns are 5 and 6 and 7%, which is in the developing world. So that's driving the export of capital. It's an inevitable process. So in a sense, you could say, yes, Jody, is that, keeping us in this the custom to which we've, and style to which we've grown accustomed. And it's also literally that, Nigel Farage tweets, why is the National Health Service in Britain breaking? It's because to go into an emergency room, you'll see it's filled with all these foreigners. Whereas one sort of radical pastor in Britain tweeted, he said, just came from the emergency ward where, my son was stitched up and it's overrun by foreigners. The nurse was Romanian and the doctor was from Congo, that sort of thing. Without these foreign labor, the systems would not work, and that goes for much of the production. So it is pointless to sort of make America great again, because it simply can't be done until, I mean, the only thing Donald Trump said was ever true, and then he backpedaled very quickly, but in the early stages of his campaign for president, he said the fundamental problem in America is people are paid too much. But that is the fundamental problem. They are paid too much. In global terms, they are paid too much. They're paid far beyond what their productivity would justify. And so this movement...
At every level.
I'm sorry?
At every level are paid too much. But I don't think American primary school teachers are paid too much.
They probably are. They probably are.
Public school.
They probably are. You can get those cheap, you can get equally good teachers for cheaper.
Oh, they can barely make ends meet.
I'm sorry?
They can barely make ends meet.
Okay, now this is the interesting thing. This is the other thing that's driving export of capital. Why are they barely making ends meet? A lot of it has to do with the cost of housing. Housing prices are kept inflated. Why are they kept inflated? Right? I mean, the cost of if you spent any time in New York or London or Tokyo, the cost of real estate is obscene, as you know. And it's actually well beyond the level at which it's economically functional, because you can't start a business in London unless you have £100,000 cash reserve just to pay your first year's rent. Who are you paying that rent to? You're paying to somebody who has done nothing in the way of productive activity with that particular investment. All it is holding rent. Okay? The logical thing to do, rather than raising teachers' salaries, would be to drop lowering house prices. But who are the chief beneficiaries of house prices? Well, we're back to the same. Pension funds are big. And then the individuals, of course, the middle class. If you say, well, we're going to cut the value of your house in half and then that'll revivify the economy, those people vote and they don't really like that idea. So you've got this sort of aristocracy of homeowners, if you will, who conspire against that sort of outcome. So a university lecturer in Johannesburg lives, even though if you do the conversion of their salary into pounds or into dollars, earning much less than a university lecturer in Britain or the United States, they're living much better. A buddy of mine who's a professor at the London School of Economics says he's a nice flat he's got in Fulham. Which is sad to see the Fulham Football Club, which is a bit of a sad thing to be sad with. But anyways, it's the upper floor of what was once a terraced house, a terraced cottage, a working man's cottage in Fulham. If you were in that same rank in at Wits, you probably by now would have 3 or 4 properties actually, as people do. So this, and if you just say, could we? Now the advantage teachers have is that teaching qualifies for the time being as a non-tradable good. So you can't, in fact, you could say, well, we can get much cheaper teachers elsewhere, but you can't necessarily import them. And this is the interesting thing about neoliberal globalization, to bear in mind, is they liberalize the labor markets for unskilled labor. That's what's driving the rise of Trump and the far right. They did not do it for skilled labor. So they said, yes, we'll allow you Western firms to hire Chinese workers, but we won't allow New York schools to hire Jamaican teachers who would teach for 20% less, perhaps, same quality of instruction. We're going to protect that market with various, usually what are guild-like, that you have to belong to the union, you have to have been certified in that stage, and so on and so forth, in order to inflate their wages. But I'm not making a moral statement. They don't deserve that. I'm simply saying that in comparative terms, you can get the same quality of output for much cheaper, much, much cheaper. So the average Canadian, let's say, is probably overpaid by a ratio of 4.
But do you take into account then, what the average Canadian needs to pay for?
Well,
right? Their housing, the education.
That would have to be adjusted,
right? Right, but I mean, people need to be paid for how they can live where they live.
So I was just going to say, so although you can get the teachers to come maybe from Jamaica and teach for a lesser wage, they still have to rent a house. So you're saying that they're willing to...
No, this brings us back to the property market. That's part of the problem in developed countries is you have this inflation of fixed assets.
So in theory you could get them to come in cheaper, but the reality is you probably couldn't because you still need to pay a rent.
You can get them cheaper, but you couldn't get them for a quarter the price now. You can get them cheaper than they are. You could certainly, for example, you could certainly get accountants for cheaper just because of, and this is increasingly what firms are starting to do, is they're outsourcing their back office support to areas where they can get it for much less. Because things like accountants are mobile. Things like even, medicine is going to be a field which is probably going to be profoundly affected by artificial intelligence because you can get a diagnosis done much more cheaply elsewhere, and you don't necessarily need the patient to be in front of the doctor. That's the old model, but in fact most diagnoses would be enhanced by a big data approach. So medicine is another profession which has been able to protect itself with kind of guild-like protections in developed countries, but that's probably going to have to change simply because the healthcare budget in Western countries is consuming a larger and larger share of economic output. Governments are under tremendous pressure to reduce costs, and sooner or later they'll probably have to do that, like it or not. Now, I think, and my argument that I've had, for example, with the left in developed countries, I think of myself as left, but I'm very critical of there's this revival of Keynesianism. The glory days of the 1950s and 60s, because that was the era of big state. As I point out, it was also the era of massive transfers from the developing world, that if you've inflated incomes in developed countries in no small measure because the exploitation of the periphery, to then call for let's go back to that and say that's a moral position is a very contestable claim, I would argue. We have to actually say, well, because the inequality within society needs to be tackled head on, but the solution is, well, let's just raise the living standard of the society as a whole, and then we don't have to tackle the class inequality, between CEOs and workers, which is the fundamental problem. But there is another aspect to this, is that this dramatic growth, if you go back to the beginning, okay, from 1800 to 1999, which is across the world, one recent estimate finds that if we took what the planet's carrying capacity for greenhouse gas emissions would be over the long term, and we said, okay, each generation gets to consume this much. That this period of massive expansion corresponds with, in a sense, we've used up the quota for the next several generations. By some estimates, children born today are going to have to consume 89% less, or emit 89% less in greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, nobody wants to face the fact that we probably cannot continue living at the standard to which we've been accustomed without serious risk of climate collapse. That we, in a sense, we have lived not literally off the fat of the land, and this is part of the other, that it was sustainable when the growth was concentrated in a small share in the 1/6 of the planet's population living in Western countries. As soon as development radiates outward, the whole thing gets, just becomes completely off the charts in terms of the impact on the environment.
I'm sorry, do you discuss income inequality in your book within societies, like not between the periphery and the core?
Yeah.
Because that seems to me
that's
what is killing, and one neighboring revolution.
And our argument is the solution to that is not something that can be found even within societies. That's a transnational. You need, in a sense, to globalize under a model that's not neoliberal in order to tackle that issue.
But what if the model that is moving out, and I think it is the model of income inequality, right? So that you just have all over the world now, not just in the core, but all over the world, a few super rich and everybody else is.
Yeah, the picture is actually a bit more complicated than that globally. What we've had is the worst widening of inequality actually of the last 30 years has been in Western countries. In the world as a whole, one of the interesting phenomena of the last 30 years has been the growth of middle class in developing countries, a very large middle class. So if you look at the income distribution in China, for example, it's actually become less unequal, although there is a big gap between the very richest and the very poorest, that's true. You don't have the massive, widespread erosion. What you're having in Western countries is that disappearance of the middle layer as it becomes more extreme. But we both agree that you're seeing the emergence of a global aristocracy, which is actually, and we argue this is very, very dangerous to the whole sustainability of the
And
system.
that perhaps this is the first era in which there could be globally a very sort of super rich class.
Well, there already is.
Tiny super rich class globally, not just in Rome, not just in the metropolis. And that could become the system, right? Not just.
But it's also probably not sustainable, is our argument, that the system becomes, to have any political system, the levels of income inequality globally are approaching levels very similar to what was the case right before the French Revolution. There was this, decades-long worsening of income distribution until the system becomes, when you have a majority of the population who have no interest. I mean, this is a problem that South Africa is starting to face up to. You have people who, if you say, but if you do what you say you want to do, you're going to destroy the system, and they point to the conditions in which they live and say, how much worse would that be? You see, it's a very dangerous situation. No, it is. It is a very dangerous situation, and we think that's the biggest threat to the future sustainability.
John, Jonathan, for a question. So I'm not a political science or political economy expert by any means, but I'm trying to phrase this nice and slowly so I don't stumble over it too badly. It sounds like it's quite apparent that there's going to be a transfer already underway. There's a transfer of power and influence between the West and the East. I think what's still very fuzzy in my mind is, can we see them as two distinct entities? Because we've got a globalized trade network already. I see them as distinct, but also the same organism. Are we talking about is it right to conceive of the West as an independent thing that could collapse independently of the East? Or, and just to tag on to that, there's going to be a transition period, and I'm trying to envision if that transition period is going to be a slow, gradual one. It seems like it's going to be a lot faster than the build-up period. But what sort of time frame are we talking about here with that transfer of power?
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's a good point you touched upon, Deb, isn't it? Yeah. That, again, the standard model of Roman imperial decline, coming back to Gibbon, people still talk about this all the time, is very slow, gradual decline that takes place over centuries. And what Peter has established is that, in fact, it's not going to establish it. The historiography was already pretty clear. But as I say, they haven't got the memo because, Ashmogel and Robinson say it's when Rome ceased to be a republic that it became an empire. And that's when the institutions change and you get this slow decay that sets in, and the collapse takes centuries, but it happens. In fact, Rome reached its greatest economic prosperity after it became an empire. And it reached its peak in the 4th century. The unraveling is very quickly. So this kind of effect, is, if we're saying, is actually, it's the politics catching up with the economics, if you will. The imbalance become, in 1800, the average income in any given country of the world, the average per capita income was more or less the same. By 1999, it's about 50 to 1, which is to say that in Western OECD countries, for doing fundamentally the same job, you're earning about 50 times what the person in the average developing country is. And by that point, though, the development, the economic development, which gives, and as I argue, or we argue, it's not primarily now military, although there is that. China's military is becoming more assertive and more powerful, and it's certainly building up its capacity, but it's not primarily in the realm of military conflict, it's much more in trade negotiations. So the kind of thing we're seeing going on between Trump and China, this is a big change, of course, 30 or 40 years ago. You wouldn't have had a president having to impose tariffs that are going to cause the local stock market to fall and cause, possibly bring about, worsening economic conditions in the United States, because they could have dictated the terms more or less. Now, China just has a lot more to bargain with, that they can reciprocate. They can say, well, if you're going to put tariffs on us, we'll put tariffs on you. And of course, American firms are pressuring their own government, please don't do it. We lose access to that market. There goes our year's profits, and that's going to affect share prices, which is going to also, all those pension funds, all those retirees whose votes you're hoping to get are going to be told, well, we may have to cut our payouts this year because share prices have fallen because the president's engaged in a trade spat with China. So that is happening very rapidly, and they're having a hard time wrapping their mind around this idea that they simply can't dictate the terms of the relationship anymore. I mean, it is really, when you think about it, in the context of human history, that in the mid-19th century, British and American gunboats literally were able to open up markets in China and Japan on their terms and just more or less give a treaty. It's unimaginable. That kind of relationship today is simply unimaginable, that the Americans are complaining the Chinese are killing us in trade. And not without, some legitimate complaints the Chinese are killing.
What makes it unimaginable now, right, is not that there aren't people who have huge arsenals and bigger armies and boats and everything else now than we ever did before, right? So what makes it unimaginable now? It seems to be...
Oh, I didn't say, did I say unimaginable?
I think
no,
so.
I said, what was unimaginable was that, no, I can't see the Americans forcing, I can't see the British sending a gunboat to China. Gavin Williamson, when he was defense minister, said this, the British cabinet is just such a font of idiocy at the moment, it's really delightful.
Yeah.
And he said that he was going to send an aircraft carrier to China.
It's like, I'm just interested in the question, what makes it laughable and imaginable?
Well, no.
Is it we have certain international understandings?
No, it's not that. It's more than that, Jody. It's more than that. It's more than that, because when Gavin Williams said, why does he say where they're going to send an aircraft carrier to China? Because he says China's being too assertive in the South China Sea. And because Gavin Williamson, like so many in the British Conservative Party at the moment, are still thinking, Britannia rules the waves. What was the response to the Chinese? It wasn't to send an aircraft carrier to Britain. It was to inform the Treasury that the visit by Nigel Hammond, not Nigel Hammond, what's his name? Hammond, I always say Nigel because I'm confusing Nigel Washington. Anyway, the Chancellor of the Exchequer had planned a high-level visit to Beijing to negotiate a trade agreement, which of course the Brexiteers the Tories are so anxious to get, to say, we don't need Europe, we can have a trade deal with China. And they cancelled it. And the damage done in Britain was, it caused tremendous consternation, because the Chinese can do that. They can say, well, we'll talk about trade when it suits us. So sending a gunboat to, of course, as they did in the 19th century, meant the Chinese have to accept a trade deal. Sending a gunboat in the 20th century means the British lose access to the trade they so desperately want. And they're being told, come back when you learn how to behave. So I think the game has changed dramatically without a shot needing to be fired.
Okay, I want to bring something else, and it's kind of two forces that I'm not sure how to consolidate. I'm kind of curious to hear your views. If I understand it correctly, the argument you're trying to make is, in terms of the empire, is that the decline can be caused by peripheral or the outside kind of forces, external forces, or what you said, it can be the internal forces. But ultimately, I suppose it's the interplay of the two, and somehow it would happen. But in which other case, the empire would rise and decline, so it's kind of cycle. And I think that's also kind of coming out from when you talk about developing country, developed country, that kind of one goes up, one goes down. Kind of there's a cycle, and I suppose in the statistical point of view, that they will call it regression to the means. I mean, everything, if it's too good, it will come down. If it's too bad, I mean, it will go up. So, but on the other hand, I mean, the other phenomenon we kind of see more and more is kind of winner takes all now.
Winner takes all.
And the consolidation, the kind of whatever merger acquisition, it kind of seems to be the past, depending on whatever reasons, but that phenomenon seems to be also taken quite strongly. So in a way, these two seems to be quite incompatible. And I'm not entirely sure how, in terms of history, in terms of contemporary kind of world, which force would be more dominant, or which things would trigger which cycle of it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my first question. The second question is totally kind of irrelevant, which is I find it interesting you're talking about earlier, it's the labor, which is kind of driving the mobility, and now it's the capital. But if you look at the current situation, I mean, obviously the US dollar is no, I mean, it's still dominant, but the dominance is greatly reduced. I mean, now we talk about euros and Chinese yuan and or whatever things, but there's also the whole Bitcoins. I mean, they're trying to bypass the whole nation kind of thing. So eventually, if this part changes, what will drive? What will be mobile? I mean, if there would no longer be a single currency, that would people would buy, or people that's mobile, what would drive it? What would become the new mobility thing?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. And I don't know if anybody has the answer. I think it's we're living through a time of rapid change, and the very successive cryptocurrencies. My own theory about cryptocurrencies is what Bitcoin specifically was created by anarchists who I think are looking to blow up the financial system. So, and in fact, it may work. But incidentally, I gave a public lecture in London 8 years ago on Bitcoin, just after it had been created, and I told my audience, if you have a few pounds to spare, buy a few Bitcoins, because it's going to go up. At that time, it was trading at $100, and right now it's at 6,000. Of course, it reached 18,000. I wish I'd taken my own advice. But I did anticipate that what it was doing, it was trying to take advantage of the fact of these ultra-loose monetary policies in Western countries, and basically the purpose of which is to debase the currencies, and therefore this would attract, because its supply is fixed, it would inflate the value of Bitcoin, and that's exactly what happened. Having said that, for the time being, despite the fact that other currencies are increasingly being used principally as reserve currencies, the vast majority of global trade is still priced in US dollars and still transacted in US dollars. So I think that particular role won't change yet. On the other hand, I do think there's a sort of sell-by date on the very loose monetary policies of Western central banks. Sooner or later, I think the world will say, well, if they just keep printing dollars, eventually they will lose their value. They hold their value because we all want to hold them. But if in fact the Chinese are very aggressively trying to promote the use of the renminbi, and of course the bank they've created, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, will be a very effective way for them to sort of advance that cause. But I still think that for the foreseeable future, global trade will still be conducted primarily in US dollars. The euro, as a reserve currency, as I say, you hold it in reserve, so it's there, but you're not really transacting business in euros. Even when the Europeans are doing business with the Iranians, they're still doing it in US dollars, which is why all those banks, why the Americans can impose sanctions. I do think the Trump administration's policies will be counterproductive, because to the extent that they keep imposing sanctions because you have to trade US dollars and we can stop you from trading at all, is encouraging governments increasingly to look at finding other means to transact business. So I think it will accelerate the decline of the US dollar. But on the other hand, if Trump were to lose the election next year, I think that process would be interrupted. I don't think I think he's the only person who seriously.
Possibly in that scenario, it's also whether there is going to be a strong alternatives emerging. I mean, if there's no feasible alternatives, obviously that was stuck. But until that emerges, and we don't know when, then that will change the situation.
Yeah, and at the moment there isn't one. There's no obvious alternative. You could say that. What is it? I think it's something like, I'm going from memory here, so don't quote these figures. But immediately after the war, over 90% of global reserves were held in dollars, and now it's down around 70%. But if you would then say, okay, well, what are the other currencies coming along? There's a whole bunch of, euros is only about 5% or something like that. Swiss francs is less than 1%. Gold, and of course, so they're not terribly liquid. There's not really much trade going on in Swiss francs. It's just you hold it there, and then if you are going to use it for trade, you change it into US dollars. And I think that would probably, I think the only real solution, or the only real alternative, would be a global currency created by a multilateral agency like
That's the quantum.
the World Bank and the IMF do these special drawing rights. That's kind of, but it's not. It's really used for very specific purposes.
What about the decision of China and Russia to trade in their own currencies? Will that maybe have an effect?
No, I think I don't think so. I don't think so. And the reason I say that is, there was this 19th century Russian general who once told his Tsar, he said, when we dress up in military uniforms and parade, you have to understand that we're just plain, grown up. Russia was referred to by, I think it was Helmut Schmidt, during the Cold War when it was a superpower. He said it's upper volta with missiles. That it's essentially a third world economy, very small, not very dynamic, and not very industrialized, and it's the little scientific research capacity it had has been largely eroded. Putin has been assisted in his own mission of making Russia great again, frankly, by the I think, sort of ignorant complicity. And I say ignorant in the sense I think they just don't realize they're doing it, of people like Donald Trump. Their intelligence, their sort of hacking of Western elections has been the most effective thing they've done in foreign policy to advance their agenda. And principally, the goal is simply it's sort of just to tie people up and tie Western countries up so they can't, that they're a bit more internally divided, but it's not actually advancing Western interests. But the actual volume of global trade that Russia transacts is so small. And the other interesting thing about that particular relationship, it is very much Russia recognizing we have to cozy up to the Chinese because they're more dominant than and they will continue to be more dominant. And this is an opportunity because the relationship with the United States, both our relationships are so fraught, we could perhaps try and seize that window of opportunity. But I think the transactions that would occur between those countries as a share of the total global volume of trade is so small. You see, the thing about US dollars is that two countries trading with one another, rather than use their own currencies, have to use the US dollar because they know they can go to any other country in the world and use those US dollars. Because everybody accepts international settlements in US dollars. If you're dealing with any other currency, the trader will say, well, if we have business in Europe, we'll take euros, but it's less easy to transact euros, and it's much less easy to transact Canadian dollars or whatever, South African rand. Though I was interested to see that even South African rand, are held as a reserve, very, very small share, but are held as a reserve currency by some central banks. So even South African rand is I guess for as long as South Africa is gold, you would say, well, we can always use Iran to buy gold and put gold in our vaults. You know, and maybe it's just a little confidence in the future. I don't know, but did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
Right, does this bring us to the end? We can continue informally. Yes, I would like to. But thanks very much.
Oh, no, my
thanks
pleasure.
for
I
your
hope it was too.
participation. And we'll see you in the next sessions. Thanks very much for coming.